There is a hill in central China that no archaeologist will dig into. It sits just outside the city of Xi'an, covered in grass and pomegranate trees, and beneath it lies the burial chamber of the man who first united China. An emperor guarded, we now know, by an entire army of clay soldiers. But the soldiers are only the doorway. According to a historian writing 2,000 years ago, inside the mound itself is a whole underground world. A map of the empire with its great rivers reproduced in flowing liquid mercury, and a ceiling painted with the stars. For decades that sounded like myth. Then scientists ran a soil test over the mound and found mercury exactly where the rivers should be. And still, no one will open it. That tomb is number 1 on this list. But it is not the only grave that has left the world's best archaeologists staring at a locked door, a missing body, or a name they cannot prove. These are 10 of the most extraordinary tombs ever found, and every one of them still keeps a secret. Let's start the countdown. Our first tomb was found because of a fight between grave robbers. In February 1987, on the north coast of Peru, looters broke into a crumbling adobe pyramid called Huaca and hauled out sacks of gold. The haul was so rich that the robbers turned on each other. The argument spilled into the open, the police got involved, and word reached a local archaeologist named Walter Alva. What Alva found when he took over the site was almost unheard of. An intact, unlooted royal tomb of the Moche, a civilization that flourished on this coast between roughly 100 and 700 AD, centuries before the Inca. Inside lay a man in his late 30s, buried around 300 AD, with 451 objects of gold, silver, copper, and turquoise. A gold funerary mask, headdresses, and 2 enormous ear ornaments, each inlaid with a tiny movable warrior in turquoise. His regalia matched a figure from Moche art known as the warrior priest, and he became famous as the Lord of Sipán, often called the Tutankhamun of the Americas. He did not travel to the afterlife alone. Buried around him were 6 other people, 3 young women, 2 warriors whose feet had been amputated, and a child, along with a dog and 2 llamas, and a guard sealed in a niche above the chamber. But here is what still keeps Moche scholars arguing. We tend to picture these tombs as the graves of warrior kings, powerful men at the top of a violent society. Then, in 2024, archaeologists at a nearby site called Palenque uncovered a painted throne room built for a Moche woman who appears to have actually ruled. That discovery has forced a real question back open. How many of the priestesses excavated on this coast were in fact sovereigns, and how much of Moche power was female power we've been misreading for decades? The Lord of Sipán, in other words, may not have been quite the kind of ruler we assumed. The next tomb was opened, quite literally, by accident, by a crew laying water pipes. In 2023, during work to upgrade the water supply on farmland at Giugliano, just north of Naples, workers hit a wall. Archaeologists assumed it was the boundary of a known Roman cemetery. It wasn't. It was the sealed front of a chamber tomb, its doorway still closed by a slab of tough stone that had not been moved in about 2,000 years. When they opened it, they found something almost unreal. A Roman tomb with its frescoes completely intact, the colors still vivid, the air inside undisturbed since the burial. Painted across the wall was Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guards the underworld, being seized by Hercules in the last of his 12 labors. Around it was sea centaurs, winged spirits, and painted funeral couches on which the dead still lay. The team named it the Tomb of Cerberus. In 2024, they went further and opened a sarcophagus inside. The body was still there, wrapped in a shroud that had partly mineralized over the centuries, laid out with glass perfume bottles and a bronze strigil, the curved tool Romans used to scrape oil from the skin at the baths. Chemical analysis of the remains found traces of creams made with wormwood and a plant called chenopodium, part of how the corpse had been treated. And yet, For all that detail, the most basic fact is missing. Nobody knows who this person was. The frescoes and the couches say this was someone of real local importance, probably from the nearby Roman town of Liternum. But there is no inscription naming them. Archaeologists are now waiting on DNA and further analysis to put a name, or at least a family, to the figure in the shroud. 2,000 years of perfect preservation, and the one thing the tomb won't tell us is whose it is. In 1994, a Mexican archaeologist named Fanny Lopez Jimenez was doing repair work on the steps of a small pyramid at Palenque, deep in the jungle of Chiapas, when she noticed a sealed passage. Behind it was a chamber. Inside the chamber was a stone sarcophagus, and when the team lifted the lid, everything inside, the walls of the coffin, the grave goods, and the skeleton of the woman lying within, was coated in a brilliant blood-red powder. It was in the summer of 1939, on a heath in Suffolk, England. A self-taught archaeologist named Basil Brown was digging into a grass mound at the request of the landowner, Edith Pretty. As he worked, he began to find iron rivets, lines of them, laid out in a shape he slowly recognized. He was looking at the ghost of a ship. The timber had rotted away entirely in the acidic soil, but it had left a perfect print in the sand. An 88-foot Anglo-Saxon vessel, dragged up from the river and buried whole. Amidships, in a collapsed burial chamber, lay one of the greatest treasure hoards ever found in British soil. 263 objects. There was gold and garnet jewellery, a great gold belt buckle, Byzantine silver bowls carried all the way from the eastern Mediterranean, and, most famous of all, an iron helmet with a face mask shaped into a dragon, an object that has become the very image of the Anglo-Saxon age. In 2012, archaeologists working near Amphipolis in northern Greece began uncovering the largest ancient tomb ever found in the country. A marble wall, nearly 500 feet across, ringed a single burial mound, and when the team, led by Caterina Peristeri, tunneled inside in 2014, the scale only grew stranger. 2 headless sphinxes guarded the entrance. Beyond them stood 2 caryatids, marble maidens more than 7 feet tall, one arm each raised as if to physically block anyone from going deeper. The floor was laid with a pebble mosaic showing the god Hades seizing Persephone and carrying her down to the underworld. The tomb dates to the last quarter of the 4th century BC, the age of Alexander the Great, and that timing, plus the sheer expense of the monument, set off one of the most heated debates in modern Greek archaeology. Who was important enough to be buried like this? Alexander himself is ruled out. Ancient sources place his tomb far away in Egypt, but the candidates that remain all orbit him. His closest companion, Hephaestion, whose death Alexander ordered commemorated on a lavish scale. His mother, Olympias, executed around the age of 60. His wife, Roxana, and their young son. When the bones were finally analyzed, the puzzle deepened rather than resolved. The remains belonged to at least 5 different people. A woman over 60, 2 men in their 30s or 40s, a newborn infant, and a 5th individual who had been cremated. One of the men bore deep cut marks, signs of a violent death. 5 people, of 5 very different ages, in one royal tomb. It fits no single tidy story. Ancient looting and earthquakes had scattered. In 1977, the Greek archaeologist Manolis Andronikos made a discovery he called the achievement of a lifetime. Digging under a huge mound at Vergina, the ancient Macedonian capital of Aigai, he found a cluster of royal tombs, and one of them, untouched by looters, contained a gold chest, a larnax, embossed with the 16-rayed star of the Macedonian kings. Inside were cremated human bones. Andronikos announced to the world that he had found the grave of Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, assassinated in 336 BC. It was a sensational claim. It has also been argued about, fiercely, for nearly 50 years. The problem is that the tombs at Vergina are hard to tell apart with certainty, and Philip II had a half-brother, Philip III, who was killed and recremated only a few years later. Some forensic teams looked at damage on a skull from the tomb Andronikos studied and saw the eye wound Philip II was known to have suffered in battle. Others looked at the same bones and saw ordinary cremation damage and argued the tomb actually belongs to the half-brother. Then, in 2025, a team led by Yannis Maniatis published a new study using radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA, and isotope analysis on the remains in one of the tombs, the so-called Tomb of Persephone, or Tomb 1. The results were startling. The adult man in that tomb had died somewhere between 388 and 356 BC, years before Philip II was assassinated. In other words, whoever he was, he could not possibly be Philip. That single finding knocked out one of the leading theories overnight. So where does that leave the father of Alexander the Great? Genuinely uncertain. The traditional identification still has strong defenders. The rival camp still argues for the half-brother, and the newest science has, if anything, made the picture more complicated rather than less. One of the most famous graves in the ancient world, tied to one of history's most famous families, and specialists still cannot agree. For over a century, one number defined Egyptian archaeology. 1922, the year Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun. It was the last royal tomb anyone found in Egypt, until February 2025, when Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities announced they had identified the tomb of a pharaoh named Thutmose II, who ruled around 3,500 years ago and was both the half-brother and the husband of the famous queen Hatshepsut. A joint Egyptian and British team, with archaeologist Piers Litherland leading the fieldwork, had first found the entrance in 2022 in the mountains west of the Valley of the Kings. At first, they thought it might be the grave of a royal woman. Then they found the proof, fragments of alabaster jars inscribed with the name of Thutmose II, calling him the deceased king, alongside the name of Hatshepsut. They also found pieces of a beautiful ceiling, deep blue plaster painted with yellow stars, and passages from an ancient funerary text called the Amduat, the Book of the Underworld. But the tomb was almost completely empty and badly damaged. Shortly after the burial, it had flooded, and the water tore through the chamber. And this is where a real controversy begins. Litherland's theory is that the tomb is empty because the ancient Egyptians deliberately moved everything out after the flood. The body, the treasure, all of it, to a second hidden tomb nearby. He has even suggested that a mummy in Cairo, labelled as Thutmose II since the 19th century, may not actually be him. Egyptian authorities have presented the find more simply as the confirmed tomb of the king. So which is it? Is this the pharaoh's true resting place, emptied by a flood and time, or just the first of two tombs, with the real burial still sealed under tons of rubble somewhere in those hills? Litherland is convinced there's a second tomb waiting. As of now, no one has found it, and the first royal tomb discovered in Egypt in over 100 years has arrived carrying a brand new mystery. We can't talk about tombs without returning to the most famous one of all, but not for the reason you'd expect. The gold, the mask, the boy king, you know those. The real live mystery of Tutankhamun's tomb is what might be hiding behind its walls. In 2015, the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed something startling. Tutankhamun died young and unexpectedly, and his tomb is oddly small and oddly shaped for a pharaoh. Reeves argued that it was never meant to be his at all, that it was originally the tomb of a queen, and that behind the painted north and west walls lie sealed rooms that were part of that larger, older burial. And the queen he had in mind was Nefertiti, whose own tomb has never been found. The idea set off a scientific chase. A radar scan in 2015 seemed to show voids behind the walls, and Egyptian officials briefly declared they were 90% sure a hidden chamber existed. But a second scan in 2016 contradicted the first. To settle it, a definitive survey was carried out in 2018 by a team from the Polytechnic University of Turin, using 3 independent radar systems. Their conclusion was blunt. With a very high degree of confidence, there are no hidden chambers next to the tomb. That should have ended it. It didn't. Reeves rejected the radar results as unevenly done, and in 2022 he came back with a different kind of evidence: the paintings themselves. On the burial chamber wall, a scene shows the pharaoh Ai performing the funeral rites for Tutankhamun. Reeves claims that underneath, an earlier version of that scene shows Tutankhamun performing the rites for someone else, which would mean the wall was originally painted for an earlier burial, and that the tomb really does extend beyond it. Mainstream Egyptology largely accepts the radar's verdict. There is nothing there. But largely accepts is not the same as proven, and Reeves has not backed down. Somewhere between the world's most studied tomb and a painted wall that may or may not be a door, the question quietly refuses to die. Is Nefertiti still in there? And so we come back to that hill outside Xi'an. In 1974, farmers digging a well struck a life-sized clay head. What they had found became one of the wonders of the world. The terracotta army, thousands of individually sculpted soldiers, archers, horses and chariots, buried to guard China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who died in 210 BC. But here is the part people forget. The terracotta army isn't the tomb. It's the guard standing outside it. The emperor himself lies under a separate earthen mound nearby, and that mound has never been opened. We have a description of what's supposed to be inside. 100 years after the burial, the historian Sima Qian wrote that the underground palace held scale models of the empire's great rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze, reproduced in liquid mercury and mechanically made to flow, all beneath a ceiling set with the stars of heaven. For centuries this read like legend. Then scientists tested the soil over the mound. They found mercury far above natural levels, averaging several times the background reading, and remarkably, concentrated toward the northeast and south, roughly where those 2 great rivers would sit on a map of China. The ancient account, it seems, was describing something real. So why not dig? The answer is a hard lesson written on the warriors themselves. When they were first sculpted, the terracotta soldiers were brightly painted over a layer of lacquer. But once that lacquer is unearthed and hits the dry air, it begins to curl within about 15 seconds and can flake away within minutes, taking the original color with it. Archaeologists have watched 2,000-year-old paint vanish in front of them. Now imagine that risk applied to an entire sealed palace, possibly flooded with toxic mercury vapor, using tools we don't yet have. China's own authorities have said plainly that there is no mature technology to protect what's inside. So they wait. Less than 1% of the vast necropolis has been excavated, and the central chamber, the actual tomb of the first emperor, sits exactly where it has for over 2,000 years, sealed, studied only from the outside, guarding the one secret no one is willing to risk destroying to learn. That's the paradox of the greatest tomb on Earth. We may already know roughly what's